The rain hammered against the canvas roof of the command tent, somewhere in the forests of eastern France, as Colonel Robert Mitchell stared at the map spread across the folding table and wondered if he was about to send 200 men to their deaths. The plan before him was audacious, some would say suicidal. Use a unit of artists, designers and sound engineers equipped with inflatable tanks and audio equipment to impersonate an entire armoured division and hold a critical gap in General Patton's line for 72 hours. On paper, it was the kind of desperate gamble that only made sense when every other option was worse. "Sir, with all due respect, this is insane." Major Philip Harrison stood on the opposite side of the table, his arms crossed, his face flushed with barely contained anger. Harrison was 34, a career officer who had spent the last 3 years fighting his way across North Africa and into Europe with actual combat units. Being assigned to what amounted to a travelling theatre company masquerading as a military unit had been a humiliation he still hadn't accepted. "We're not soldiers. We're artists and engineers playing dress-up. The moment the Germans realise they're facing rubber tanks and tape-recorded sound effects instead of real armour, they'll roll right through us and tear a hole in Patton's entire offensive." Mitchell didn't respond immediately. He was 41 years old, a former advertising executive from Chicago who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor and somehow ended up commanding the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, officially a deception unit, unofficially known as the Ghost Army. Before the war, his biggest concerns had been selling cigarettes and soap. Now he was being asked to sell the Germans a lie so convincing that thousands of lives depended on their believing it. "That's exactly why it might work, Phil," Mitchell said quietly, using his finger to trace the critical gap on the map between Metz and Nancy. "The Germans expect us to think like conventional soldiers. They expect armour where there's armour, infantry where there's infantry. They don't expect a handful of art school graduates with inflatable decoys and a sound truck. The audacity of it is the whole point." Across the tent, Captain Daniel Rousseau, their chief sound engineer and former radio producer from New York, looked up from the technical specifications he'd been studying. Rousseau was 32, thin and nervous, with glasses that constantly slipped down his nose and hands that trembled slightly when he talked. He had never wanted to be in the army, had tried to get an exemption based on flat feet and poor eyesight, but had been drafted anyway and assigned to this bizarre unit where his knowledge of audio recording suddenly made him valuable. "The sound systems will work," Rousseau said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We've tested them. The recordings of tank movements, artillery fire, radio chatter, they're convincing at distance. But, Colonel, we've never held a position this long. 3 days? The manual says 48 hours maximum for any deception operation. Beyond that, the risk of exposure increases exponentially. If they send scouts, if they capture one of our men and interrogate him, if someone gets a good look at the equipment—" "Then we better make damn sure they don't," Mitchell interrupted. "Operation Iron Veil begins at 0600 tomorrow. The 6th Armoured Division is pulling out tonight to plug the hole near Bastogne. That leaves us to convince the German 5th Panzer Army that the 6th Armoured is still here, still dug in, still a threat to their left flank. General Patton himself approved this plan. We hold for 72 hours, just long enough for the real 6th Armoured to get into position at Bastogne. Then we disappear, like ghosts. Questions?" Lieutenant James Nakamura raised his hand. Nakamura was 26, a Nisei soldier from California whose family was in an internment camp while he fought for the country that had imprisoned them. He had been an art student before the war, specialized in sculpture, and now spent his days inflating rubber tanks and positioning them to look authentic from the air. He was one of the best they had, meticulous, creative, fearless, but Mitchell could see the doubt in his eyes. "Sir, The German reconnaissance planes fly over twice a day, usually at dawn and dusk. We can fool aerial photography with proper placement and camouflage. But what about ground observation? What if they have spotters in the villages? What if they decide to probe our lines with infantry? Then we shoot them, Mitchell said flatly. We may be a deception unit, but we're still armed. Every man in this outfit has a rifle and knows how to use it. We have real machine guns positioned at key points. We have actual anti-aircraft batteries. The deception is the armor, not the firepower. If the Germans probe, they'll encounter real resistance. Not enough to stop a determined assault, but enough to make them think twice about testing what they believe is a full armored division. Staff Sergeant Victor Kowalski spoke up from the back of the tent. Kowalski was 38, a former stage designer from Broadway who now designed battlefield illusions. He was also the unit's biggest cynic, a man who had seen too many plans fall apart in execution to trust anything that looked good on paper. "Colonel, I've been doing this job for 18 months now. We've pulled off some impressive ops. The diversions before D-Day, the Brest operation, covering the advance at St. Lo. But this is different. This isn't a diversion or a feint. This is holding ground. The Germans aren't stupid. They've been fighting this war for 5 years. They know what real armor sounds like, what real tank tracks look like, what real radio traffic sounds like. We fool them from a distance, great, but the first time they get close, the first time they realize they're shooting at rubber and canvas, then we've bought Patton 3 days to save Bastogne, and that's all we need to do." Mitchell's voice was hard now, the voice of a commander who had already made his decision and wouldn't tolerate further dissent. "I know the risks. I know this could go wrong in 100 different ways. But I also know that if we don't hold this gap, the German counter-offensive breaks through, Bastogne falls, and we're looking at another 6 months of war. Maybe longer. How many lives is that worth? 10,000? 20,000? We're 200 men. If we can save that many lives by pretending to be an armoured division for 3 days, then that's what we're going to do." The tent fell silent except for the drumming of rain on canvas. Mitchell looked around at the faces of his officers. Harrison angry and sceptical, Russo terrified but resigned, Nakamura calculating odds, Kowalski cynical but professional. These were the men who would help him sell the greatest con job of the war, or die trying. "Dismissed," Mitchell said. "Get your men ready. We move out at 0400. The officers filed out into the rain, leaving Mitchell alone with his maps and his doubts. He poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon from the bottle he kept hidden in his footlocker, a violation of regulations, but one he figured he'd earned, and drank it in one swallow. The plan was desperate, yes. Possibly suicidal, yes. But it was also brilliant in its audacity. And Mitchell had learned that in war, the difference between a brilliant plan and a suicidal one often came down to luck and timing. He just hoped they had enough of both. At 0400, the Ghost Army began its transformation. In the darkness before dawn, 200 men moved with practiced efficiency to create an illusion that would have made P.T. Barnum proud. Inflatable tanks were pulled from trucks and positioned in carefully calculated spots, visible from the air but hidden enough from ground observation to avoid detailed scrutiny. Each rubber Sherman weighed about 60 pounds and could be inflated by 4 men with a pump in less than 15 minutes. From the air, they were virtually indistinguishable from real M4 Shermans. Nakamura supervised the placement with an artist's eye for composition and a soldier's understanding of tactical positioning. He positioned the fake tanks in clusters that suggested a battalion in defensive formation, added camouflage netting that was deliberately imperfect. Real units made mistakes, looked sloppy, and even went so far as to create fake tire tracks, leading to and from the positions using actual tank treads they'd salvaged from destroyed vehicles. "Make it look lived in," he instructed his team. "Scatter some ration tins, dig some latrines, hang some laundry. Real soldiers don't keep a clean camp. We want the Germans to see exactly what they expect to see. A tired armoured unit that's been in the field for weeks." While Nakamura created the visual deception, Russo and his sound crew set up the audio component. They positioned speakers in the tree line and began playing recordings of tank engines, the distinctive rumble and clank of armour on the move. They broadcast fake radio traffic, orders, acknowledgements, situation reports, all carefully scripted to sound authentic. They even had recordings of mechanics working on vehicles, sergeants shouting at their men, all the ambient noise of a real military encampment. "Volume is critical," Russo told his operators, adjusting levels on the recording equipment. "Too quiet and they won't hear us. Too loud and it sounds artificial. We need it to carry to German listening posts, but still sound natural. Remember, sound travels differently depending on weather, time of day, terrain. Keep adjusting based on conditions." By dawn, the transformation was complete. Where there had been an empty forest, there now appeared to be an entire armoured division. Tanks positioned in defensive formations, support vehicles scattered throughout the area, command posts with radio antennas, even a makeshift motor pool with mechanics supposedly working on disabled vehicles. It was all smoke and mirrors and rubber and recordings, but from a distance it was convincing. The first test came at 07:30 when German reconnaissance planes made their morning pass. Mitchell watched through binoculars as two Messerschmitt Bf-109s flew over at about 3,000 feet, their pilots undoubtedly photographing the American positions. Would they see through the deception? Would the fake tanks look too perfect, too clean, too obviously fake? The planes circled once, then banked away to the east. No bombs dropped. No radio chatter suggesting alarm. They had bought it. "Phase 1 complete," Harrison admitted grudgingly. "They think we're real. Now we just have to maintain the illusion for 71 more hours." The first real crisis came on the second day, when a German patrol stumbled into their perimeter. 6 men, reconnaissance troops from the 5th Panzer Army, moving through the forest to scout American positions. They were perhaps 50 meters from one of the inflatable Shermans when Sergeant Kowalski spotted them through his binoculars. "Contact," he hissed into his radio. "German patrol, Sector 3, 6 hostiles approaching the tank park." Mitchell felt his blood turn cold. This was the moment he had dreaded. Actual German soldiers close enough to see that the tanks were rubber balloons. If even one of them escaped to report what they'd seen, the entire operation would collapse. The Germans would know they were facing a phantom army, and the 5th Panzer Army would punch through the gap toward Bastogne. "All units hold fire," Mitchell ordered, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "Let them get closer. We take them all at once. No survivors, no radio transmissions. Understood?" A chorus of quiet acknowledgements came back. Mitchell moved to a firing position behind a genuine machine gun emplacement, one of the few real weapons they had. He watched the German patrol advance, saw them pause to examine the tree line, saw them conferring in hushed German about what they were observing. The patrol leader, an older sergeant with a weathered face, pointed toward one of the inflatable tanks and said something to his men. They began moving directly toward it, weapons at the ready but not raised. Curious, not alarmed, not yet. 30 meters, 20, 15. The German sergeant reached out to touch the tank's hull. "Now!" Mitchell shouted. The forest erupted with gunfire. The machine gun in Mitchell's hands roared, tracers cutting through the morning mist. The 6 Germans went down in a matter of seconds, cut apart by concentrated fire from multiple positions. It was brutal, efficient, and absolutely necessary. "Cease fire," Mitchell called. The guns fell silent. "Nakamura, Kowalski, police the bodies, strip them of anything identifying this unit, make it look like they ran into regular infantry, bury them deep. Harrison, check for radio transmissions. If they reported before we hit them, we're compromised." Harrison sprinted to the communications tent, while Nakamura and his team moved out to deal with the bodies. Mitchell stood watching, the machine gun still warm in his hands, and tried not to think about the fact that he'd just ordered the execution of 6 men whose only crime was doing their job. "No transmissions, sir," Harrison reported 10 minutes later. "They didn't get a signal off. As far as German command knows, this patrol just disappeared." "Then we have time," Mitchell said, "but not much. When that patrol doesn't report back, they'll send another one, bigger. We need to encourage them to stay back, to believe we're too strong to probe casually." That night, Russo's sound crew went into overdrive. They played recordings of tank movements all night long, suggesting constant repositioning and reinforcement. They broadcast fake radio traffic about fresh units arriving, about ammunition resupply, about orders from Corps headquarters. They created the audio landscape of a major military operation, all to convince German listening posts that the 6th Armoured Division wasn't just present, it was being strengthened. By the morning of Day 3, Mitchell could see the strain on his men. They had been living on adrenaline and coffee for 72 hours, constantly adjusting the deception, maintaining round-the-clock surveillance, ready at any moment for the Germans to call their bluff with a full assault. Private Tommy Chen, one of Nakamura's team, had developed a tremor in his hands from exhaustion. Corporal Eddie Martinez had stopped sleeping entirely, convinced that the moment he closed his eyes, the Germans would attack. "How much longer, Colonel?" Harrison asked. He looked haggard, his uniform rumpled, his eyes red-rimmed. "The men are at their breaking point. We can't sustain this much longer." 6 more hours, Mitchell replied, checking his watch. "The 6th Armoured reaches Bastogne at 1400. At that point, we begin our withdrawal. We pack up the circus and disappear before the Germans realize we were never really here." But the Germans had other plans. At 1100 hours, the artillery barrage began. German 105 mm howitzers, firing from positions 3 kilometers to the east, began systematically shelling the American lines. Real explosives falling on fake tanks, destroying rubber and canvas with the same efficiency they would have destroyed steel and armor. "Take cover!" Mitchell shouted, as the first shells screamed overhead. The men scattered, diving for foxholes and trenches, abandoning the inflatable equipment to its fate. Explosions walked across the fake tank park, each detonation sending fragments of rubber and fabric spiraling into the air. The barrage lasted 20 minutes. When it finally stopped, Mitchell emerged from his foxhole to survey the damage. 1/3 of their fake tanks were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Fires burned in 3 locations. Worse, the forest was full of smoke and the distinctive smell of burning rubber. Nothing like what burning steel would smell like. "They're probing us," Harrison said, appearing at Mitchell's side, "testing our response. If we don't react like a real armoured division would react, they'll know." "Then we react," Mitchell decided. "Russo, get on the radio. I want fake casualty reports, requests for fire support, all the noise a real unit would make after taking incoming fire. Nakamura, salvage what you can and reposition. Make it look like we're regrouping after the bombardment. Harrison, take 10 men with real weapons and set up forward observation posts. If they follow up with infantry, I want early warning." For the next 2 hours, the Ghost Army put on the performance of their lives. They broadcast panicked radio traffic. They set off smoke grenades to simulate burning vehicles. They even fired their own mortars, real ones, with real shells, in a counterfire mission designed to suggest they had substantial artillery support. It was all theatre, but it was convincing theatre. At 1300 hours, Major Harrison's forward observers reported German armour moving into position, 5 panzer fees and at least 2 companies of infantry, preparing for what looked like a probing attack. The Germans were going to test the American lines with real force, expecting to encounter real armour in response. "We're out of time," Harrison said flatly. "We can't stop 5 tanks and 200 infantry with what we have. 2 machine guns and some rifles against that. We'll be overrun in minutes." Mitchell looked at his watch. 1400 hours, the moment the 6th Armoured was supposed to reach Bastogne, was still 60 minutes away. They needed 1 more hour. Just 1. "We bluff," Mitchell said. "We make them think attacking us would cost them more than it's worth. Rousseau, do we still have the recording of the tank battalion moving out?" "Yes, sir, but—" "Play it. Full volume. Make it sound like we're manoeuvring armour to meet their attack. Nakamura, take every smoke grenade we have left and create a screen in front of our positions. I want them to think we're hiding something big behind it. Harrison, position the machine guns to create overlapping fields of fire. If they come, we hit them hard enough to make them think they've run into serious resistance." "Sir, this is insane," Harrison protested. "We're going to get people killed for 1 more hour." "And if we don't hold for 1 more hour, the Germans break through to Bastogne and thousands of people die," Mitchell shot back. 1 hour, Phil. That's all I'm asking." The tanks came at 13:30, advancing cautiously across the open ground in front of the Ghost Army's positions. Behind them, German infantry moved in loose formation, weapons ready. Mitchell watched through binoculars, his mouth dry, his heart hammering. The smoke screen went up, thick white clouds obscuring the tree line. Behind it, Rousseau's speakers blasted the recorded sounds of tank engines, the distinctive rumble and clank that every soldier recognized. To the advancing Germans, it sounded like an American armor formation was maneuvering just beyond visual range. The German tanks halted. Their commanders were radioing back to headquarters, probably requesting instructions. Should they advance into the smoke against what sounded like a superior force? Should they wait for additional support? Should they probe with infantry first? Mitchell held his breath. Everything depended on what decision those German tank commanders made in the next few minutes. The lead Panzer-Vis turret traversed left and right, as if searching for targets. Then, slowly, the tank began to reverse. The others followed suit. The infantry, seeing their armour support withdrawing, began to fall back as well. "They're retreating," Harrison whispered, disbelief evident in his voice. "My God, they're actually retreating." "They think we're stronger than we are," Mitchell said, relief flooding through him. "They think the cost of attacking is too high. They're going to wait for reinforcements or orders from higher up. Either way, they're giving us time." At 1400 hours exactly, Mitchell received the coded radio transmission he'd been waiting for. Package delivered. The 6th Armoured Division had reached Bastogne. The real armour was in position. The gap in Patton's line was closed. "All units," Mitchell broadcast on the company frequency. "Operation Iron Veil is complete. Begin withdrawal procedures. We're going home." The Ghost Army packed up with remarkable speed, decades of theatrical experience translated into military efficiency. The surviving inflatable tanks were deflated and loaded onto trucks. The sound equipment was broken down and stowed. Within 2 hours, the forest that had appeared to house an entire armoured division was empty except for shell craters and abandoned positions. By the time German reconnaissance patrols arrived the next morning to investigate why the American armour had fallen silent, they found nothing but tyre tracks leading west and a few pieces of damaged rubber that meant nothing without context. The Battle of the Bulge raged for another month. Bastogne held, in part because the 6th Armoured Division had been able to reinforce it at a critical moment. That reinforcement had been possible because the German 5th Panzer Army had believed its left flank was threatened by American armour and had committed reserves to defend against a threat that didn't exist. Operation Iron Veil was never officially acknowledged. The reports filed simply stated that deception operations had been employed to support the movement of Allied forces. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops received no medals for their 3-day charade because medals would have required explaining what they'd done, and what they'd done was classified. But 23 years later, in 1968, Colonel Robert Mitchell, by then a retired advertising executive living in Connecticut, received a letter from a German veteran named Klaus Schmidt. Schmidt had been a tank commander in the 5th Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge. He had been one of the officers who had decided not to press the attack against what he believed was a full American armoured division dug in near Metz. The letter read, "I have recently learned, through declassified documents, that the American armour formation my unit encountered in December 1944 was not real. We were deceived by inflatable tanks and sound recordings. I write not to complain, but to express my admiration. You made us believe a lie so thoroughly that we changed our battle plans based on it. That takes not just technical skill, but understanding of the human mind, of fear and caution, and the desire to avoid unnecessary casualties. In a war filled with brute force and bloodshed, you won your battle with creativity and cunning. As a fellow soldier, I salute you. As someone who survived that war when many of my comrades did not, I thank you for choosing deception over destruction." Mitchell kept that letter framed on his office wall until his death in 1989. Beneath it, he had placed a photograph of the Ghost Army, 200 men who had saved thousands of lives by refusing to fight like conventional soldiers, who had proven that sometimes the best weapon is the one that doesn't exist. The plan should have failed. By every logical measure, it was too ambitious, too risky, too dependent on the enemy making decisions based on incomplete information. But it succeeded because Mitchell and his men understood something fundamental about warfare. Battles are fought not just with weapons and armour, but with perception and belief. Make the enemy see what you want them to see. Make them believe what you want them to believe, and you can win without firing a shot. Operation Iron Veil entered the history books as a footnote, a minor deception operation during the Battle of the Bulge. But for the soldiers who fought at Bastogne, for the thousands who might have died if the German breakthrough had succeeded, it was nothing less than salvation delivered by artists and engineers who knew how to paint with smoke and canvas and recorded sound. The memorial for the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops wasn't built until 2014, nearly 70 years after the war ended. It stands at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and features bronze sculptures of soldiers inflating a rubber tank. The inscription reads, "To the men who fought World War II with imagination and creativity, they proved that sometimes the greatest weapon is the one that never existed." Of the 200 men who participated in Operation Iron Veil, only 4 were still alive for the memorial's dedication. They stood together, old men now, and remembered 3 terrifying days when they had held off an army with nothing but rubber balloons and recorded noise. "Did we really think it would work?" one of them asked. "No," another replied, "but we did it anyway. That's what soldiers do." And that, perhaps, is the real lesson of Operation Iron Veil. Not that clever deception can defeat superior force, though it can. Not that technology and creativity can change the course of battle, though they can. But that sometimes, when everything is at stake and the odds are impossible and the plan should fail, ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things simply by refusing to accept that failure is inevitable. The battle plan that should have failed succeeded because the men who executed it never allowed themselves to believe it couldn't work. They sold the Germans a lie, and they sold it so completely that it became a kind of truth. For 72 hours, the Ghost Army was a real armoured division, not because of what it was, but because of what everyone believed it to be. And in war, as in life, sometimes belief is the only weapon that matters.